very excited to be here, though. We already had a great morning so far. We did a customer advisory board meeting downstairs with some of our customers, and I always enjoy doing those because you really spend a couple of hours diving into the product, into technology, get a lot of great feedback, and I hope we will continue doing that here. Right? The reason why we are actually doing those events, we did one, as Lisa mentioned, in Sydney, we did one in New York, we'll have one in San Francisco in 1-2 months. The reason why we are doing those events is because we want to bring all of you together, right? You all face similar challenges. You work in different companies, obviously, different industries to a certain degree. But I think if you are a data professional or a security professional, ultimately, you're dealing with similar challenges. So our goal here is, yes, we will have a couple of presentations. I have a presentation. We will have a panel discussion. We'll share some knowledge. But then we have a happy hour and some drinks. So please stay around until the end and then have a discussion, right? Talk to somebody else in the audience, ideally a person you don't know. I know some of you maybe came with somebody, but make an effort, talk to somebody who you don't know yet, because we really want all of you to learn something and share your experience with somebody else, because we are on this journey together. And the journey we are on is really to unlock the value in your data, right? I mean, you all know, I'm probably not telling you anything new here. You know that data can be incredibly powerful, and your organizations and your company already has a lot of data, right? That's not the problem. You have a lot of data. It probably sits a little bit in the cloud. Maybe you're already full in the cloud. More likely, it probably sits in an on-premise system, right? So the challenge is, how do you unlock the value in the data, move the data to the cloud, really leverage the data, build data products, help your data scientists build and train better models, help your analysts do their job better and faster, right? That's the problem we are facing and the challenge we're all trying to overcome. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But before I get there, I actually want to zoom out a little bit and take a step back, because every year when I actually grew up in Europe, I grew up in Austria, so every year when I go back for the holidays, see my parents, I take some time to reflect, right? Maybe I get a cup of tea or a hot chocolate, sit inside until it's snowing outside, and I think about, well, how did the last year go, or how did the last 2 years go? And when I reflected this year, a couple of weeks ago, I have to say, the last couple of years, the last 3 years, were actually pretty crazy, right? Like, we had COVID, we had a global pandemic, or we still have a global pandemic, depending on who you ask. That obviously brought a lot of human suffering, but also a lot of, I think, many challenges at work, right? Suddenly, everybody was working from home. Now everybody's kind of back in the office, but maybe not full time, right? We're doing this hybrid, remote, 3 days a week type thing. And I don't have to tell you, right, in terms of data and data security, that can be quite challenging, right? You suddenly have people accessing data from home, which might be okay, right, if they're working from the UK, but what if they are in their vacation home, right? What if they are in Spain for a week? Is that okay, right? They're working from home, right? So it has, I think, a lot of implications that we're still grappling with and trying to figure out how to deal with it. And because that wasn't enough, right, we have some issues in the economy. I think that's fair to say, right? We have inflation, we have raising prices, we had a little bit of an energy shock because of the Ukraine war and the conflict there, and that's not over. So I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of bad things currently happening in the world, and I'm an optimist. I think it's all right, and we'll figure it out. But I think there's a lot of change in the world and a lot of uncertainty. And it's not that I can change it, you can change it, we can't change it, right? But I think we all have to be aware of what's going on in the world, and we need to think through, well, how does it impact our company, our job, our coworkers? Because I think there are some very big implications, and I just want to highlight a couple of those, right? I think what's the norm now is we have a lot of uncertainty in the world, right? You have this major conflict between the West and Russia and China to a certain degree. And that conflict we will feel in a lot of different ways, right? It's probably not surprising that, like Lisa talked about it, we see more and more data breaches, there are more and more cyber threats. That's the very obvious part. But the maybe less obvious part is that when you think about data privacy, right, in data privacy, GDPR, et cetera, it originally really started with this a little bit of a movement around, well, there's this moral right for data privacy, right? I think that's great, right? I agree with it, but I don't think it will go anywhere, to be honest, right? I mean, all I do every day when I'm in Europe is a click cookie consent like overlays, so I'm not sure how much that's helping us. But what will happen is, if you like follow the news a little bit and follow politics a little bit, is that now governments around the world are waking up and starting to take data privacy more seriously as a national security threat. Because everybody's realizing, right? If you use TikTok or if your kids use TikTok, I would say that's pretty bad, you shouldn't do that. But it's probably very, very bad if somebody working for the government is using it, if somebody working in the intelligence community is using it, or if somebody working in the military is using it, right? So everybody's waking up to that notion that, well, data privacy, whether it's like a human right or not, right? Like big debate, well, that's one way to look at it. But governments are starting to act, and they will act very decisively more and more over the next months and years, because they are starting to wake up that data privacy is very important when it comes to national security. What does that mean now for everybody who is a data professional, a security professional? Well, it primarily means there will be more regulations, right? There will be more data privacy regulations. And I can make a little bit fun of the fact, because I moved to the US 10 years ago, so I'm pretty much American by now. In the US, right, we don't have federal privacy regulation. We are the United States. We are coming up with 50 different regulations. That doesn't help any of you, or doesn't help us, right? Because instead of adhering to one framework, suddenly it's 50 frameworks. I think we will get to one federal framework eventually, but it's complicated, right? That's my point. You have GDPR in Europe. You will have federal privacy regulation in the US. You have different regulation in Australia and Japan, South Korea, and so on. And all of you, I assume, or most of you, work in like multinational corporations, right? So you need to adhere to all those different regulations, and it's hard, challenging, and tricky. And what that ultimately means is, how we always describe it when we talk with our customers, is there is what we call the cloud data dilemma, right? There is this inherent conflict between, as data professionals, we want to make data available, right? Faster access to data. We believe it's good if we are using the data we have to innovate, to differentiate, to help the business generate more revenue. That's great, right? It's also the fun part, right? If you are a security professional, though, you're probably thinking more about how do I protect, how do I lock down, right? How do I prevent the data breach? Because you're more paranoid. If you are in the privacy or compliance risk organization, you're focusing more on how do I do all of that in a compliant manner with all those additional privacy regulations that are coming out and that will continue to come out, right? So it's a very complex world, and there is this conflict, and that conflict will only get worse. I have just two examples here. When you look at what happened at Uber and then Trisly, I will focus more on the Trisly example. I don't know how many of you know that, but Trisly had a data breach. There is a FTC order in the US where the Trisly CEO now has to adhere to stricter data security requirements, but not just at Trisly, right? If he starts a new company, if he joins a new company, if he becomes CEO at a different company, that organization has to adhere to stricter data security requirements, which is a little bit insane. I think it's also good, but it's insane, right? If you think about, like, if I do something wrong, it will follow me around. What's the likelihood that somebody else is going to hire me if they can hire somebody else who is not under that order, right? It has really big implications. And I try to keep that in mind when I talk with our security team, right? Because when you are under that scrutiny and under that pressure, it's a little bit easier to understand why they're acting in the way they're acting and why they're so protective and why their default answer is no. And so when we think about how we can solve that problem, I think there's only one way. We need a symbiotic relationship between all those different stakeholders, security and data, and then privacy, compliance, and so on. Now, ultimately, right, technology won't solve all of that, right? You need a good relationship, you need the right people, you need the right culture, right? It's about more than just technology, but I'm ultimately a technologist. I like to build products, I like to build software, so I believe software is the solution to all problems. Not really, but like software can help. So how can software help with this problem? What you need ultimately is, you need one interconnected system that deals with a couple of challenges, and I will go through those three areas. The first area is you need to know what sensitive data you have. I mean, you need to know what data you have overall, right? But it makes a bit difference if you have BI, BHI, or just like data in general. So you need to know what data you have. You need to classify it, discover it, all of that. You need to be able to manage access. You need to be able to manage the entitlements. And then you need to be able to audit who is accessing it. You need to find and identify threats pretty quickly, right? So you need those three components, and they all need to be interconnected. The challenge with those different components is, if you dive a little bit into the details now, I know we started very high level with politics and what's going on in the world, and now we're suddenly in the nitty-gritty details. But I think the details matter, because when you think about sensitive data discovery and classification, and if you compare what I call here legacy and the future, right? If you compare how it's been done on-premise, how it's been done the last 10, 20 years, and how it needs to be done in the future to do well, is that in the past, it was okay if you have like this coarse-grained like overview. You know you have some sensitive data sitting in different systems, maybe in a certain table, maybe on S3 if you're already in the cloud. But it's not that accurate often. That's a huge problem. It's not fine-grained, it's not detailed, and it's not actionable, right? What does it do if you know you have some sensitive data, right? We all know we have some sensitive data sitting around somewhere, right? It really needs to be actionable. You really need to know where is it, in which column, what type of sensitive data is it, how is it governed, where did it come from, right? Locality, data residency matters a lot, and it needs to be ultimately actionable so that you can drive access controls. Because knowing what you have doesn't do much. You need to protect it. You need to make sure that only the right people have access to it. Usually, that mechanism is very static, but data is changing a lot. Data is changing constantly, especially in the cloud, right? We are gathering more and more data. Data is moving from different systems. You need to understand constantly and continuously and dynamically what sensitive data you have. Right? Maybe an additional table gets added, additional column, or new data gets into an existing table. It all needs to be reclassified, right? That needs to happen on the fly. It can't happen once a week, once a day, once every couple of hours. It needs to be highly automated, happening instantaneously. And then you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And what I mean by that is, if your classification mechanism ignores locality and residency, you have a big problem. Because it makes a difference, right? If you have data sitting in Frankfurt, or data sitting in the US, or data sitting in Japan, you can't have this like centralized mechanism that analyzes the data. You need a mechanism that sits where the data sits, lives where the data lives, ideally inside the data store, analyze it and classifies there, so that by design and with the architecture you build, you are adhering to data residency and locality rules, because they will only get worse. Now, with access control and entitlement management, and I think the big change is, and I doubt that's surprising to anybody here in the audience, we talked about it during our customer advisory board as well, right? There is this mindset shift from RBAC to ABAC. RBAC is how we've always done it. ABAC is how we want to do it in the future. It's much more versatile. It's much more flexible, right? You want people to instantaneously have access to the data they need so that they can do their job. If they are allowed to access the data, it shouldn't be request-based. Right? It shouldn't be you open a ticket in Jira or ServiceNow, there's some back and forth, somebody approves it, and then you maybe share a data copy, right? That's really bad. You don't want data copies. Because once you share a data copy, or once you have a BI tool and an analytics tool that copies the data out of your warehouse, you can't control the data, right? It's gone. So you need to really design with an approach where there are no data copies, right? Everything is enforced natively. If you share data, you share the data inside the warehouse. If you want to revoke that access, if the permissions change, you automatically update those permissions, and then the person doesn't have access to data anymore, right? You don't have to force them or convince them to actually delete the data and make sure they deleted it. I think if you have to do that, you already lost the battle. And then last but not least, you don't want to have silos and bottlenecks. Right, all of you are probably using a variety of different systems to work with data. I know we're all trying to standardize. We want one warehouse, we want one data lake, whatever, one data mesh, right? Whatever paradigm you want to pick. But in reality, we know there will be a lot of different systems, right? And it might be because your company acquires another company, and then suddenly, right, they standardized on a different system, and then you get that system. Great, right? You both standardized, but now you're together. What's the new standard? So there will be a lot of different systems. And so when you think about controlling and managing access, you don't want to do it in a way it's been done in the past, where you have different teams, right? You might have the Teradata team, the Cloudera team, the Hadoop team. They're all managing access in their little world. And so every time there's a rule change, a policy change from your organization, they all have to go in and update it in all the different systems, right? It's manual. You also have humans involved. It's error prone. It costs you a lot of money because you staff up those different teams that deal with all the different systems. What you want is, you ultimately want a policy control plane that's centralized, where you can build a policy once, it gets enforced everywhere automatically, right? Because that's the only way how you can really do it efficiently, allow people to access the data quickly while adhering to all the controls. And the last piece, and by the way, right, I mean, we are, as Immuta, right, we are in the business of protecting data, so we have a strong opinion on how this all should be done, but whether you use Immuta for this or not, right, doesn't matter, right? Like, everything I'm listing here is something you need, right? You can use whatever system you want. You can build your own system. It's not about Immuta. The last point you definitely need, though, is controlling the access, knowing what data you have, what's sensitive, what's not, and controlling that access. That's not enough, right? If you ever went, I'm pretty sure all of you went for an audit, right? I went for an audit last week. It was very exciting. Great 90 minutes of my life. But if you've been for an audit, right, it's not enough to say, oh, we are using this system, I built it, or we bought this vendor, right? Like, it's all great, it's all secured, right? That's not enough, right? You have to actually prove with the audit information and the logs that only the right people had access to the data they should have accessed. And how you usually do that is, you do it manually, you pull a lot of information, you build those reports, you maybe manipulate information. It's very cumbersome. What you want is, you want it all highly automated, consolidated one place. An audit is always exhausting. You have to sit through it. But ideally, at least you don't have to do a lot of additional work every time you go for an audit. You can just share the report. You can prove that your controls are working, and that your approach of making data available is not a bad approach. It's the right approach for the company, and it also means you're adhering to all the privacy regulation, you're adhering to all the security controls, and you can prove that. And last but not least, you want that to actually be not only reactive, but also proactive, because when I say audit, what I mean is, right, after the fact you prove something, that's usually good enough for a compliance audit. It's not good enough in terms of security. Right? Let's say there is a breach, let's say there is an insider threat, let's say there is a malicious actor. Only knowing after the fact what they did, I mean, it's somewhat useful, right? You know the blast radius, you know how bad it is, you know how much worse it might get. But you really want, when the breach happens, you want to be able to react quickly, or you want a system that prevents the breach from happening in the first place. So that is why it's not only about audit and looking back, but only threat detection and doing it automatically. Now, everything I said here is ultimately not anything we came up with, right? What we do at Immuta is we spend a lot of time with our customers, spend a lot of time with some of the companies up on the slide. We spend a lot of time with the government. We actually got started out of the US government. We spent our early years with the US intelligence community. So what we are doing day to day, every day, is just working with the largest organizations in the world. Could be a large financial institution, could be a large healthcare or pharma company, could be pretty much in any industry. We spend time with all those companies and organizations to help them protect their most sensitive data. And so we learn a lot from those conversations and from those customers, and we are building the different best practices ultimately into our solution and into our product. Now, to talk a little bit about Immuta, because this is an Immuta event, so we'll talk a little bit about Immuta. What we are offering, what we're doing is, Immuta offers a data security platform, right? As I said, we believe you need one interconnected system. You need to know what sensitive data you have, then you can protect it through data policies that define who can access what, right? Certain people are allowed to see the whole credit card number, other people only the last 4 digits, other people nothing. You can prove that those controls worked through an audit mechanism. And you can also proactively detect malicious behavior. And that's the part I want to talk a little bit more about, because we're actually launching a new product today. And you might have seen some announcements online, or not yet, but we'll talk a lot about it going forward. We are launching a new product that we call Immuta Detect. Because what we learned through all those conversations with our customers is that, as I said, knowing what happened after the fact is not that powerful. I had a conversation with a customer of ours, I think they are not in the audience, And they said, well, if you only tell us 20 minutes before the police shows up that we had a breach, well, that's not helpful, right? It's like a little bit funny, but I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, I think we need to move beyond just like reactive audit and forensics, and we need a system that not only detects that something bad is happening, right? There are lots of systems around there. You're probably using some, right? But we need to not only detect when something bad is happening, but we need to automatically react, or we need to at least automatically let you know, let your security teams, your SOC know that something bad is happening so that you can react, right? Because once the data is out, right? If somebody does a select star and grabs the data and runs, the data is gone, right? So you need to somehow prevent that select star from happening. And you can do that if you ultimately know what data is being accessed, how much data is being accessed, who is accessing it, how sensitive it is, and you have all that information and you have all those patterns over millions and millions and millions of queries. You know what the normal behavior roughly looks like, right? You know that if there is a select star and a lot of sensitive data, that theoretically the person is allowed to access, but if they do it at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning, it's probably bad, right? So you can figure out those anomalies, that fraudulent behavior, and then you can react. And you can do that because what we have built is ultimately a system that takes all that information of who is accessing what. We normalize that across all the different cloud systems, and believe it or not, that's actually much harder than it sounds, right? Because if you've ever spent time with audit logs and information from different systems, right, Snowflake, Databricks, Redshift, etc., you will learn that it's actually very valuable information, but it's very different in every system, right? So what you need as an organization is you need one harmonized model that allows you to know what data is accessed by one user across all those systems so that you can see the patterns not only in the warehouse, but maybe in the other warehouse that you're using, right? Maybe use 3 vendors. If there's a breach happening, that user is likely using the credentials to get out data out of multiple systems, right? So you want to know that proactively, and you can only know that if you normalize all that information about who is accessing what data. You enrich it with how sensitive the data is. You enrich it with how the data was protected. Was the data really masked? Was it encrypted or not? All of those data points ultimately need to go into your system to figure out, is it a bad, malicious query, or is it actually normal and good, right? It could be an analyst preparing an important presentation, board meeting, exec meeting, etc. They're crawling a lot of information. Maybe they're doing a year-end analysis, right? It only happens once a year. Could still be a good query that should go through. So you need to really have a smart system that ultimately tells you, is it good, is it bad? Because when you think about security, it's not only sufficient, right, to detect something and tell you. You probably all got alerts at some point about something. Nothing is more annoying than you getting an alert and it's a false positive. And then you have to go through the motion, you have to acknowledge it, right? A lot of processes get kicked off internally. It's very annoying if it's a false positive. So what you need to make sure is that whatever that system is producing, it needs to be highly accurate. It needs to give you a way to react and confirm whether that behavior is really bad and learn from that. Because ultimately, right, latency is crucial when it comes to security, right? We believe fast access to data is great for the data teams. For the security teams, it's equally important to quickly know if something is going wrong and if something is bad is happening, right? Only analyzing after the fact is not enough. You need a system that automatically tells you what's happening, is it good, bad, allows you to react, and then ultimately address the root cause, right? Because if data is being extracted, what are you going to do about it? Right? Ultimately, you can maybe shut down access completely, but what if there is no malicious behavior? Maybe somebody just has too many permissions, right? Maybe somebody moved from one group to another team, from one business unit to another business unit, permissions weren't updated. There's no malicious behavior, it's just somebody having still too much access, right? How you react in that case is not that you shut everything down, you adjust the permissions. How do you adjust the permissions? You do that by adjusting the policy. Ideally, you adjust the policy automatically. And that's ultimately why you need one system that really talks with all those different components. You know what's sensitive, you know the behavior that's going on in the system, and you can address and adjust by fine-tuning your policies so that only the right people have access to the data, but they have data access quickly, because that helps you build better data products ultimately. That's why we are launching what we call Immuta Detect. It gives you this continuous data security monitoring solution that allows you to improve your data security posture over time. So you can see, well, maybe today we are granting too much access, maybe today we are not granting sufficient access. And you can see how you evolve that over time, right? Because ultimately you are in a journey and you're always trying to be in the middle, right? Where you're satisfying security requirements, you're satisfying compliance requirements, but at the same time, you're empowering the data team. Because that's ultimately what we want, right? We want the data team to leverage the data, build data products, build better models, train models. We want to allow the analysts to do their job better, so we don't want to overreact and lock everything down. We need to land somewhere in the middle, meet the security team, ideally in the middle, and we believe a system like Immuta can help to do that, because ultimately it will help everybody speak the same language and secure data, but also make data available. With that being said, thank you very much.